Hi everyone, my name is Rosalie Flynn. I'm going to be talking to you guys today about my thesis topic, which I titled American Propaganda, Manufacturing Consent for Imperialist War. Before we jump into the content of my presentation, I just wanted to give a brief overview about what I'll be talking about. First, I'll talk a little bit about the propaganda model that guided my thesis. Then I'll move on to the first section of my thesis, which was Afghanistan. Then I'll talk about the second section of Iraq, the third section of Libya, and then move on to some concluding statements. I focused my thesis research on how mass media facilitated military intervention and warfare in other countries. Guided by these general questions, I wanted to learn what the role of the media was in America's imperialist action and destruction around the world. First, I started off with Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model. Herman and Chomsky assert that the consent provided by citizens of the United States has been manufactured. It was fabricated through manipulation of the mass media to create a false image of reality, whereby common citizens unwittingly share the concerns, beliefs, and motivations of the most powerful class in society. They proposed a propaganda model of American news in which raw stories are processed through these 5 filters before they reach us, and these filters determine which stories become news and which are discarded. The first filter refers to the size, concentration, and elite ownership and for-profit motive of the media. The second, the reliance on advertising as their primary source of income. The third, reliance on information provided by government, big businesses, and other official experts that are funded by the powerful. The fourth, flack as a disciplining mechanism. And fifth, ideology. Initially, when they wrote the book, this referred to anti-communism, and now it can refer to a more general ideology of neoliberalism. This continues to function as an instrument of discipline and control. The first section of my thesis focuses on the invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. Historic discrimination of Arab and Muslim people can still be seen in the media that we're exposed to today. Orientalism is a concept first defined by Edward Said. It creates an unequal, dichotomous view that places us, the West, the Occident, at direct odds with them, the other, the Orient. The Orient is seen as inferior, barbaric, uncivilized, and ahistorical, while the Occident is the superior, cultured, civilized, and dominant society. Images consistently depicted by media outlets, television shows, and Hollywood movies covertly influence viewers that military action against these populations is both justifiable and morally right. A second theme I came across in media coverage of Afghanistan was the selective and feigned activism for women's rights in the country. Much of this concern was symbolized in the image of a woman covered with a veil or wearing a burqa. A familiar trope or caricature in literature, media, and films poses Muslim women as oppressed and in need of savior. A woman wearing a veil is often viewed by Westerners as oppressed and in need of liberation. The U.S. was still selective when raising concerns of Afghan women's rights. Throughout the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan, the U.S. had funded groups with very similar beliefs to the Taliban to fight against the Soviets. No concern was raised when these groups were working to further U.S. interest. During the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan throughout the 1980s, both the U.S. and Pakistan recruited the most anti-communist Islamists from around the world to fight Soviet troops, providing them with maximum firepower, intelligence, and financial support, while Pakistan's intelligence agency set up and ran training camps that utilized CIA methods and manuals. None of this information was acknowledged or investigated by mainstream media, as they continued to refer to Soviet opposition fighters as mujahideen or freedom fighters. This covert war needed more money than Congress could supply. The mujahideen, with the aid of the U.S. and Pakistan, expanded the growth of opium and the trade of heroin in the country. Drug trafficking was both started and expanded. By the end of this war, these borderlands became the world's greatest producers of opium and heroin. Although the media and U.S. government framed the Taliban as the cause and the main beneficiaries of the drug trade, this is hypocritical. Today, the country struggles with almost double the global average of heroin addiction. My second section on Iraq. The US and UK cited 3 primary reasons why military intervention in Iraq was necessary: possible possession of weapons of mass destruction, alleged support of terrorists, and promotion of democracy. The first 2 claims were made at the outset of war, while the latter only surfaced when the previous 2 crumbled. The Bush administration employed several techniques in the build-up to war in Iraq, including the indirect connection of Iraq to the attacks in 9/11. 1 month before the official start of war, 93% of Americans believed Hussein had direct involvement in 9/11. The odds of mass media viewers seeing a pro-war source compared to an anti-war source was sixfold. The West, led by the US, carried out invisible warfare against Iraq from 1990 up until Iraq was taken in 2003. Brutal economic sanctions were imposed. Despite a stated motive of depriving Saddam Hussein of money, the Iraqi civilians bore the brunt. Throughout the sanctions, the US directly blocked over 200 humanitarian aid contracts. These economic deprivations and a lackluster humanitarian assistance program resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. Despite the blame being on the US, they continued to point the finger at Saddam Hussein for any deaths or ill impacts on the Iraqi population. Iraq had resisted transformation and full integration into the global financial system for decades. The invasion and occupation of the country allowed the US to force neoliberal policies using an interim government comprised of Western officials. Swift changes transformed Iraq, eliminating social programs, government subsidies, free healthcare, and more. Economic restructuring opened up Iraq to transnational corporations and foreign investors, while plunging Iraqis into further disrepair with rising unemployment and unmatchable competition for domestic businesses. And yet, these changes were labeled as creating democracy and promoting freedom. The American propaganda system depicts the military as heroic, humble, and patriotic, working to protect our country while committing the ultimate sacrifice. And yet, the public rarely sees the culture that keeps this machine running. When images were leaked out of Abu Ghraib prison in 2004, the public finally witnessed what Slavoj Žižek called the obscene underbelly of American society, the brutal, necessary antithesis to everything patriots love and know as American. For freedom, personal dignity, and democracy to exist, a parallel culture of torture, abuse, and violence must uphold it. These obscenities are not uncommon to the US military, but another way of asserting invincibility, imperialism, and power. My final section covered the situation in Libya in 2011. Muammar Gaddafi was seen as a threat to Western hegemony. Muammar Gaddafi had identified shortcomings of both capitalism and communism in his Third Universal Theory. His alternative ideology and his commitment to African unity called for self-determination to challenge Western control over the continent. His advocacy for African and Arab nations was a threat to this hegemony. Part of Gaddafi's aims for continental and cultural unity revolved around a proposed currency to be shared across African and Arab nations, which would replace economic dominance of the West. Gaddafi's leadership also limited Libya's complete transition to neoliberal policies, stymieing both Western interests and desires of wealthy, Western-educated officials pushing for reforms in the country. Coverage of the situation in Libya throughout the period of Arab Spring in early 2011 was relatively sparse in the US. However, passions first arose in the east of Libya, primarily in Benghazi. Protesters were met with a harsh crackdown by police and a number of protesters took up arms and began fighting against Gaddafi's regime. Parties in the content were characterized dichotomously by media, the rebels as freedom-loving revolutionaries, and Gaddafi's forces as evil and murderous mercenaries. Members of the international community began to raise concern over a coming genocide. They portrayed Gaddafi as an evil madman prepared to murder thousands of his own people to crush the revolt. And yet, no strong evidence or intelligence suggested this threat. The UN Security Council passed a resolution for the protection of civilians. NATO emerged as the enforcer. NATO's response in Libya was excessive, arguably illegal, as NATO provided air cover and support for the rebel troops while actively bombing Gaddafi's forces. Their actions illustrated that their intention was never to protect innocent civilians, as they killed dozens of families in Iraq airstrikes, but to facilitate the demise of Muammar Gaddafi. Ultimately, they were successful. The modern military acts as an adjunct of diplomacy and political globalization. It forces the adoption of neoliberal policies if prior methods proved unsuccessful or governments were non-compliant. Neoliberal humanitarianism, comprised of the benevolent spread of democracy, the protection of innocent lives, the benign building of nations, and the liberation of people suffering under dictators, is a mythology comprised of illusions completely unlike situations on the ground. Realistically, these themes are symbols created for propaganda purposes and supported by adherents to neoliberalism. In conclusion, I found significant evidence to support Herman and Chomsky's propaganda model in the media's promotion of modern military interventionism. Despite negative impacts on domestic populations, the media tended to highlight the limited positive information while suppressing scandals, death, and destruction. Neoliberal ideology was present in many forms of media, from newspapers to Hollywood films, and it continued to promote militarism in our society. Officials and media pundits tend to use neoliberal political jargon to sway the general public from what their words actually imply. Democratization can be translated into the destruction of a nation, while humanitarian intervention is code word for aerial bombardment. It was difficult to find alternative viewpoints criticizing popular narratives in the United States regarding the US and NATO's military actions in foreign countries. Here are all of my references. Thank you for listening, and take care.